All right, you ready for this? We're going deep on the whole thread of fate idea today.
Yeah, it's one of those things that can seem kind of mystical, you know?
But it's also surprisingly, like, down to earth when
Yeah.
you really dig into it.
Right, exactly.
You know, the source we're looking at, this thread of fate guide,
Mm.
it sounds like something straight out of fantasy.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
It's packed with some seriously thought-provoking ideas.
I think what's really cool about it is that it, like, takes these really old questions, about fate and free will, and it
Right.
brings in these, like, ancient ideas, but also really modern insights.
Okay, so for our listener who maybe hasn't stumbled across this guide yet, can you tell us, like, what is this thread of fate?
Well, think of it as it's a metaphor, right? It's a metaphor for how everything's connected.
So not like a literal thread hanging over our heads.
No, no, not at all.
Okay.
The guy's really clear about that. It's more like, imagine a giant web, but it's invisible, and it connects everything that exists.
Okay, so every action, every choice we make, it's like
Sends out ripples, yeah.
plucking a spider web, and you can see those vibrations go throughout the whole thing.
Yeah, exactly. And those ripples, that's the thread of fate happening. Like, nothing's ever really lost, no connection is ever truly broken, and every single moment is tied to all these other moments.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
So how does this thread actually work? Does the guide get into that?
It does. It breaks it down into these three core components: the echo of the past, the unbroken link, and then the imminent thread.
So past, present, future, it's all woven together by these threads.
Exactly. And that's where this idea of resonance comes in. It's not about, like, controlling these threads,
Right.
but realizing that everything you do, every action, it has an energetic consequence.
Yeah.
It creates new threads. It strengthens the ones that are already there.
So we're all kind of weaving our fate as we go, whether we realize it or not.
That's what's so fascinating about this, right? The guide's saying that if we can become aware of these threads, then we can start making choices that are, more in line with what we actually want to create.
Okay, but the guide also mentions these 10 forms of the thread. Heck, I gotta say, some of them sound a little out there.
They do, don't they?
Yeah.
But they're basically like different ways this thread of fate shows up in our lives.
Like the echoed thread, for instance.
Right.
That one's supposed to enhance memory, help us relive past experiences.
Crazy clarity, yeah.
Yeah, like super vividly.
Right.
Or there's that omens link one, which is described as like having a sixth sense for important moments.
Oh, totally. Think about a time when you just had this really strong gut feeling.
Yeah.
And it led you to make a big decision. Like, that could be the omens link doing its thing, right? It's like you're sensing those threads that connect us to what might happen.
Interesting. So instead of like wrestling with fate, we're trying to understand it, listen to it.
Exactly. And the guide's really big on this idea that these threads, they respond to our awareness. So the more we try to understand them, the more they kind of reveal themselves to us.
This is making me think about those times when it feels like a small choice led to this huge life change,
Oh, yeah.
Almost like it was meant to be.
Right? Like those events were always connected somehow.
Yeah, exactly.
That could be the thread of fate working behind the scenes, connecting all these things that seem random.
So the past really does influence the present, and what we do now can shape the future.
That's the idea. And it's not about getting lost in the past or obsessing over the future. It's more like, if we understand how these things are connected, we can make better choices. We can navigate our lives more effectively.
Makes sense. Now, the guide also dives into the mechanics of fate.
It does.
Which sounds very...
very technical.
Yeah, very technical. What can you tell us about that?
Well, the guide outlines three main concepts. There's the weaving process, then resonance and activation, and finally, the law of inevitability.
So how does this weaving process work? Are we literally like weaving a giant web with every decision?
Well, in a way, yeah. Every action we take, every choice we make, every relationship we have, it creates new threads in this web. Some of them fade away over time, but others, they can get stronger, especially if we focus on them.
Oh, interesting. So it's almost like we're constantly making new threads, strengthening old ones, and sometimes even, I guess, cutting threads.
Exactly. And what's really wild is that even the threads we try to cut, like choices we've made that we want to forget, they still leave a mark on us.
So there's no escaping our past, huh? It's all woven into this thread, shaping who we are.
That's the message, yeah. The past shapes us even if we're not thinking about it. And that actually brings us to resonance and activation.
Right.
Because that's all about how we interact with these threads.
Okay, so this is where it gets tricky, right? How do we actually use these threads to, like, make our lives better?
Well, the guide says it's all about aligning our energy with the natural frequency of these threads. It's not about forcing things or controlling things. It's about understanding and working with them.
So it's less about fighting the current and more about learning how to, like, ride the wave.
Exactly. And the more aligned we are with a specific thread, the easier it becomes to work with it.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it.
Yeah.
But this law of inevitability, that one sounds a little, well, a little
we're
scary.
gonna know, right?
Yeah.
But it's actually not as limiting as it sounds. What it basically says is that once a thread is formed, it's there. You can't pretend it never happened.
Okay.
So we can't erase our past choices, but we also don't have to be, like, trapped by them.
So how does that work? How can something be inevitable, but also something we can, I don't know, break free from?
Yeah, it's definitely a paradox, right? But the guide says that free will, it doesn't mean controlling the threads. It means choosing which threads we align ourselves with.
So it's less about being a puppet and more about choosing which path to take.
Exactly. It's like, imagine a huge network of paths, and every choice we make, it leads us down a different one.
Okay. I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together.
Yeah.
It's not about denying fate.
Yeah.
It's about realizing that we actually have a say in how things play out.
Right. And that's where the real power is. Aligning ourselves with the threads that really matter to us, the ones that line up with our values and what we want deep down.
Okay, now this is all super fascinating,
Yeah.
but the guide also talks about the risks and consequences of all this, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's not all sunshine and roses.
Yeah, I was going to say there's got to be a catch.
We should definitely unpack those maybe in the next part of our deep dive.
All right, sounds good. We'll dig into the risks and consequences next time.
Because they're definitely something to think about as we keep exploring this thread of fate idea.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So join us for part 2 where we'll get into the nitty-gritty of the risks and consequences of working with the thread.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
All right, see you there.
Yeah.
All right, so last time we were getting to this whole thread of fate thing.
We were, yeah. It's a lot to unpack.
It is, and like we promised, we got to talk about the risks, the downsides.
Yeah, because it's not all, magic and destiny.
The guide definitely doesn't sugarcoat it.
No, not at all. It's very upfront about the potential dangers, especially if you're not careful.
Okay, so let's just get right to it. What are the risks? What do we need to watch out for?
Well, the guide talks about 2 main ones. It calls them entanglement in the weave and then the tethering effect.
Okay, those sound kind of intense. Drink those down a bit.
Sure. So entanglement in the weave, that's basically what happens when you get overwhelmed by the thread.
Overwhelmed how?
Like, imagine trying to see everything at once, past, present, future, all these connections.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot.
It is. You could lose your grounding, your sense of being in the present moment.
It's like too much information overload.
Exactly. And the guide's really big on this idea of focus.
Right.
Like, you got to be selective about which threads you're tuning into.
Okay, that makes sense. Want to get lost in the web, so to speak. What about the tethering effect?
Right. So the tethering effect, that's when a particular thread, it becomes really strong, really hard to break free from.
Because you're focused on it.
Exactly. The more you dwell on something, a past event, a bad memory, the more power it has over you.
Oh, that sounds like a recipe for, like, anxiety or regret.
It can be, definitely. And that's why the guide stresses the importance of acknowledging the past, but not letting it consume you.
So learning from it, but not letting it define you.
Exactly. It's all about finding that balance. And that actually brings us to another really important point, which is the danger of trying to, forcefully sever threads.
Wait, I thought we were just talking about letting go of certain threads.
Yeah, but there's a difference, right? Like, sometimes a thread naturally fades away.
Okay.
But other times, we try to cut it completely. Like, we try to erase a part of our past or totally disconnect from someone. And the guide's saying that can actually create more problems.
Like, it's more damaging.
Yeah, it's like ripping a piece of fabric instead of carefully untying a knot. It can leave this, energetic wound.
And those wounds, would come back to haunt you?
They can, yeah. The guide suggests that those severed threads, they often resurface, sometimes in ways you wouldn't expect.
Okay, that's a little crazy, not gonna lie. So what's the alternative? Like, how do we deal with those threads in a healthy way?
Well, the idea is to integrate them, to weave them into the bigger picture of your life.
So not pretending they don't exist, but finding a way to, make peace with them.
Exactly. And what's really cool is that the guide doesn't just leave us with warnings, it actually offers some practical ways to use the thread of fate, for good.
Okay, now that's what I want to hear. What kind of practical stuff are we talking about?
Well, One technique is called retracing one's own path. It's all about using the thread to reconnect with a time in your past when you felt really aligned, like you were on the right track.
So going back in time, energetically speaking,
Mm.
to find that, like that sense of purpose again.
Exactly. Not to change the past, but to learn from it, to remember what it felt like to be in that flow.
I can see how that would be helpful, especially if you're feeling lost or stuck.
Yeah, definitely. And then there's strengthening connections, which is all about using the thread to deepen the connections you have with people, places, even events.
Okay, so focusing on the things that bring you joy, the relationships that matter.
Right. And the guide's saying that these connections, they exist on an energetic level, so even when someone's not physically there anymore, you can still strengthen those threads.
That's a beautiful thought.
Yeah.
Like, the people we love, they're never really gone as long as we remember them.
Exactly. And the guide also talks about using the thread to find closure, for things that were left unresolved.
Oh, that's interesting.
Like maybe there's some unfinished business from your past or
Yeah.
you need to forgive someone.
Right.
And the guide's saying that these opportunities, they often show up in unexpected ways. Like you might run into someone you haven't seen in years, or you get this sudden burst of inspiration.
This is making me think about all those times when something seemingly random happened,
Yeah.
and it turned out to be this huge turning point.
Right. That's the thing about the thread. It encourages you to see those connections, to trust that there's a bigger plan, even when you don't understand it.
Okay, this is all starting to make more sense.
Yeah.
But if we can't control the thread, how does that work with free will?
Right. That's a good question.
Like, are we just along for the ride?
Well, the guide says that free will, it's not about controlling the threads, it's about choosing which threads to align with.
So it's less about being a puppet and more about, like, choosing your own adventure.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you're navigating this huge network of paths, and your choices determine which path you take.
Okay, I like that analogy. So it's not about denying fate, but about recognizing that we have a role to play in shaping our own destiny.
Exactly. And that's where the real power lies, aligning yourself with the threads that resonate with who you really are, what you really want.
This is all pretty mind-blowing stuff.
Right.
But how do we know if any of this is real? Like, is there any evidence to support this whole thread of fate idea?
That's a fair question. And to be honest, the guide doesn't offer any scientific proof.
Okay.
It's more about approaching it with an open mind, seeing it as a way to understand how everything's connected.
So it's more about the exploration than finding the definitive answer.
Exactly. And the guide even says that even if you don't fully grasp the thread, just acknowledging it can change your perspective.
I think that's a really valuable insight.
Yeah.
Like, even if it's a metaphor, just thinking about it in this way can change how we view the world.
Absolutely. It can make us more aware of the choices we're making, the connections we're forming.
Yeah, right. Okay, so we've talked about the risks, we've talked about the potential benefits, but how do we actually start living a more, I don't know, a more threat-aware life?
That's a great question, and I think that's where the rubber really meets the road. So maybe in the next part of our deep dive, we can explore some specific techniques, some practices
Let's do that.
that can help us align with the thread and really start harnessing its power.
Awesome. So join us for part 3, where we'll get into the practical side of all this.
Yeah, it's going to be good. I'm looking forward to it.
Me too. See you there.
See ya.
All right, so we've gone pretty deep on this whole thread of fate concept.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
And honestly, I'm starting to see things in a whole new way. Like, I'm noticing connections I never even thought about before.
It's awesome. That's exactly what the guide encourages, that
Yeah.
shift in perspective.
But I think our listeners are probably wondering, like, okay, this is all very interesting, but how do I actually apply this to my life? How do I start living more, I don't know, thread aware?
That's the key question, right? And the guide doesn't give us like a set of rules or anything,
Yeah.
but it does offer some really insightful ways to start aligning ourselves with the thread.
So what are some things people can actually do?
Well, I think the foundation of it all is just becoming more aware. Remember, the guide says the thread is always there. We're just not always paying attention.
Right, so being more mindful, noticing those little synchronicities.
Exactly. Those gut feelings, those moments where it's like, whoa, what are the chances?
Yeah, those weird coincidences.
Right. And it's not just about noticing them. It's about taking a minute to think about what they mean.
Okay, so like journaling about it or meditating, anything that helps you process those intuitive hits.
Exactly. And once you start tuning in, you can try some more deliberate techniques.
Like what?
Well, the guide talks about visualization.
Okay.
So imagine yourself actually achieving a goal, really feeling that sense of accomplishment.
So not just positive thinking, but actually picturing it like it's already happened.
Exactly. The guide's suggesting that by doing that, you're actually sending out a signal, aligning yourself with that future you want.
Hmm. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, and there's also this idea of what they call energetic cord cutting.
Okay, what's that?
It's about releasing attachments that are no longer serving you, things that are holding you back.
So like relationships that have run their course, grudges you're holding on to, that kind of thing.
Exactly. But remember, the guide cautions against forcing things.
Right.
It's not about aggressively cutting ties. It's more about acknowledging that those connections have served their purpose, and now it's time to move on.
So letting go with grace, I guess.
Exactly. And it's important to do it with gratitude and forgiveness.
Okay, that makes sense. But why go through all this? Like, what are the benefits of living a more thread-aware life?
Well, the guide suggests that when you align with the thread, your life just starts to feel more, I don't know, more meaningful, more purposeful.
And how does that happen?
By understanding the threads that have shaped your experiences, you understand yourself better,
Hmm.
your motivations, your patterns, and that allows you to make choices that are more in line with who you really are.
So you're not letting fate control you. You're using your understanding of it to make better decisions.
Exactly. And as you start aligning with those threads that really resonate with you, your life naturally starts to flow in a direction that feels more fulfilling.
It's like you're finally on the right path.
Right. But of course, there are challenges.
Oh, for sure.
It's not always easy to navigate these threads. You need patience.
Yeah,
And you have to be comfortable with not always knowing what's going to happen.
right. Because we can't just force the thread to do what we want.
Exactly. It's more about surrendering to the flow, trusting that the thread will guide you in the right direction.
But that can be hard, right? Especially for people who like to be in control.
It can be, yeah. But the guide says that as you practice aligning with the thread, you start to develop a deeper sense of trust. You realize that even when things don't go as planned, there's a bigger picture unfolding.
It's like knowing there's a safety net, even if you can't see it.
Yeah, exactly. And there's this really powerful idea the guide emphasizes, which is that there are no mistakes, only lessons.
So every thread, every experience, it all adds up to something.
Exactly. And when you embrace that, you start to see life with more curiosity, more wonder, and a sense that anything's possible.
Well, I have to say, this has been one of the most thought-provoking deep dives we've done.
I agree. It's really fascinating stuff.
I feel like we've barely scratched the surface of this whole thread of fate thing.
We have. And for our listener, if you're intrigued, you can find a link to the Thread of Fate guide in the show notes.
Definitely check it out. It's worth a read.
And remember, the journey of unraveling the thread, it's a lifelong process.
Yeah, but that's what makes it so exciting, right?
Absolutely. The possibilities are endless as long as we're willing to stay open, to trust the process, and to keep exploring.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So until next time, keep an eye out for those threads.
And happy weaving.